The world of Chthon was a masterpiece of cosmic taxidermy. From orbit, it was a beautiful, silent sphere of polished black obsidian, its surface crisscrossed with veins of a dark, non-reflective crystal that seemed to drink the light of its distant, dying star. It was a planet that had been deliberately and meticulously killed, its oceans boiled away, its atmosphere stripped, its very geology fused into a single, seamless, and eternal monument to an unknown event. For the crew of the archaeological survey vessel Ozymandias, it was the find of a lifetime. Dr. Elara Vance, a xenohistorian with a controversial and often mocked specialization in comparative mythology, stood on the bridge, her eyes fixed on the view screen. While the geologists and physicists on her team saw a planetary anomaly, she saw a story. The sheer, obsessive perfection of Chthon's sterile surface was not the result of a natural cataclysm. It was a statement. This was not a tomb world. It was a prison, built on a planetary scale with a level of technological and aesthetic dedication that was almost religious in its intensity. We have identified the power source, Commander Jax. The ship's pragmatic and perpetually unimpressed captain announced from the operations pit. It's a singularity, perfectly stable, held in a containment field at the planet's core. The energy readings are minimalist. It's not powering a civilization. It's powering a lock. For 6 months, the Ozymandias had orbited Chthon, painstakingly mapping its surface. They found only one structure, a single spire-like edifice that rose from the planet's equator. It was made of the same light-devouring crystal as the veins that crisscrossed the globe, and it was covered in inscriptions, a language so complex and so alien that the ship's translation matrices had ground to a halt. It was Elara's job to crack the code, and as she began to piece together the first fragmented phonemes, she felt a deep, instinctual chill. The language was not technical or historical. It was liturgical. The inscriptions were not a record. They were a warning, a set of rules, a litany of binding laws repeated over and over again. The pressure from the Terran Federation to produce results was immense. The discovery of a precursor race with the ability to engineer stars and petrify planets was a matter of extreme strategic importance. Against Elara's strenuous and increasingly frantic objections, a landing party was approved. The mission, to enter the spire and, if possible, access the systems within. Elara pleaded with the captain, her arguments laced with the archaic language of her own field of study. "This isn't a laboratory. Jax," she had argued in the final briefing, her voice tight with a dread she couldn't fully articulate. "This is a cursed place. Every myth, every legend, from every culture in human history has a story about a place like this. A sealed tomb, a forbidden door, a warning to not disturb that which is sleeping. We are walking into the first chapter of a ghost story, and we are ignoring the warnings on the first page." Jax had dismissed her concerns with a weary sigh. "Doctor, we are a scientific vessel, not a group of superstitious villagers. We have energy shields, plasma cutters, and a platoon of Marines. I think we can handle a ghost story." His words, meant to be reassuring, would echo in the silent halls of history as a monument to the fatal arrogance of a species that had forgotten the difference between a scientific problem and a sacred and terrible law. The interior of the spire was as silent and as perfect as the world outside. The landing party, a dozen Marines in heavy combat armor flanking a nervous team of engineers, moved through halls that seemed carved from a single solid piece of night. The air was cold, sterile, and utterly still. The only sound was the clank of their armored boots and the anxious, shallow breaths of the science team. At the heart of the spire, they found what they were looking for: a single, vast, circular chamber. In the center of the chamber, floating a meter above the floor, was a perfect, featureless sphere of the same obsidian-like material, about 3 meters in diameter. It was the heart of the prison. The engineers set to work, their sensor arrays and cutting lasers playing across the sphere's surface. They found no seams, no access panels, no energy fluctuations. It was a perfect, inert object. After hours of fruitless scanning, and under the growing pressure of a direct order from Federation High Command, the decision was made to use force. A high-yield plasma charge was placed at the sphere's base, a surgical tool designed to breach the shielded hull of a dreadnought. When it detonated, the result was not a violent explosion, but a soft, gentle, and terrifyingly final pop. The sphere did not shatter. It dissolved, its perfect black form collapsing into a cloud of shimmering iridescent dust that hung in the air for a moment before fading into nothing. For a long, breathless second, there was silence. The Marines raised their rifles, their combat sensors sweeping the empty chamber. There was nothing there. And then the teller of ends awoke. It did not appear as a monster of flesh and blood. It was not a being of energy. It was a change in the rules of reality. The first to die was the Marine standing closest to where the sphere had been. He did not scream. His armor did not buckle. He simply stopped. His forward momentum ceased. His heart stopped beating. His neurons stopped firing. The story of his life, a complex, vibrant narrative of a man named Marcus, who had a wife and a daughter on a colony world light years away, had come to an abrupt and unwritten final sentence. The teller was not a creature. It was a living, sentient, and utterly implacable full stop. Panic erupted. The remaining Marines opened fire, their plasma bolts and kinetic rounds passing harmlessly through the empty air where their comrade had just ceased to exist. Another Marine stopped. Then one of the engineers. The teller was not attacking them. It was simply ending their stories one by one, with the silent, effortless grace of an editor striking a line of text. The survivors, their minds shattering with a terror for which they had no name, fled, a frantic, scrambling retreat back to their shuttle. From the bridge of the Ozymandias, Jax and Elara watched the life signs of the landing party wink out one by one. The shuttle, carrying a handful of traumatized, babbling survivors, barely cleared the spire before the planet itself began to unravel. The beautiful, sterile, obsidian surface of Chthon began to dissolve, not with a violent explosion, but with the quiet, final dignity of a fading dream. The planet, the star it orbited, the very space in which it had existed, all of it was being erased from the cosmic narrative. The teller of ends, its story no longer bound by the prison that had been its first chapter, was free, and it was beginning to tell a new and terrifyingly simple story of its own. The story of the end. The escape of the teller of ends was not a news story. It was a eulogy for a star system. The Ozymandias, its temporal drive screaming as it pushed the laws of physics to their breaking point, was the sole witness to the final, silent death of the Chthon system. The crew watched in a state of catatonic horror as a wave of pure, conceptual nothingness expanded from where the planet had been, extinguishing the dying star and its remaining worlds with the casual indifference of a hand snuffing out a candle. The teller was not a wave of destruction. It was a wave of narrative finality. It was not destroying things. It was unwriting them. The report from the Ozymandias, a frantic, terrified data burst that was equal parts scientific observation and primal scream, sent a shockwave through the Terran Federation. The threat was incomprehensible. How could you fight an enemy that wasn't there? How could you build a shield against the concept of an ending? The Federation Council, a body of pragmatic, secular, and deeply unimaginative leaders, did the only thing they knew how to do. They threw fleets at the problem. The 1st, 2nd, and 5th fleets, the pride of the Sol Defense Force, were dispatched to the sector where the Chthon system had once been. They arrived to find a perfect, featureless, and expanding sphere of absolute blackness, a hole that had been punched in the fabric of reality. They fired their weapons, a coordinated salvo of planet-shattering torpedoes and reality-warping temporal charges that would have annihilated a lesser star system. The weapons and the ships that fired them simply vanished, their stories ending the moment they crossed the threshold of the teller's influence. There was no battle. There was no debris. There was only a quiet and growing silence. The Federation was paralyzed. Their science was useless. Their military was a liability. Their entire logical cause and effect understanding of the universe had been rendered obsolete. In their desperation, they turned to the one person who had, from the very beginning, claimed that this was not a problem of physics, but a problem of stories. Dr. Elara Vance, who had been placed under a quiet, unofficial house arrest upon her return, was suddenly and unceremoniously summoned to the Federation's high command on Earth. She was brought to a sterile, underground briefing room, the faces of the Federation's greatest military and scientific minds staring at her with a new and deeply unsettling desperation. They showed her the tactical displays of their lost fleets, the expanding sphere of nothingness, the projections that showed the teller's narrative wave reaching the first of the major colony worlds in less than a standard year. "You said this was a ghost story, Doctor," Admiral Jorek, the Supreme Commander of the fleet, said, her voice stripped of its usual iron certainty. "You were right, and we were wrong. Now we need you to tell us how it ends." Elara looked at the faces of the most powerful people in human history, and she saw in their eyes the same primal and deeply human fear she had seen in the eyes of the shuttle survivors. They were children in the dark, and they were finally ready to listen to a story. Elara's new laboratory was the beating heart of the Federation's archives, a vast, silent library that contained the entire, collected history of human thought. Surrounded by the data ghosts of 1,000 forgotten cultures, she immersed herself in the only piece of evidence they had: the full, unedited recordings of the inscriptions on the Cathon spire. The Federation's translation matrices had failed because they were looking for a language of science and history. Elara knew she was looking for a language of law, of magic, of pure binding ritual. She did not use computers. She used her mind, her intuition, her deep and often mocked understanding of the universal structures of myth and folklore. She looked for the patterns, the repeated phrases, the poetic structures that were the telltale signs of an oral tradition, of a story that was meant to be spoken, not just read. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to find the key. The language of the precursors was not a language of nouns and verbs. It was a language of concepts and consequences. It was a form of cosmic, contractual law. The first rule she translated was the one that gave her a sliver of hope, a tiny, flickering candle in the all-consuming dark. It was a rule that had been inscribed over and over again on the spire's base, a foundational principle of their terrible magical science. That which is given a name is bound by that name. The precursors had not just imprisoned a monster, they had defined it. They had given it a name, the teller of ends, and in doing so, they had given it a nature. It was not a god of infinite random power. It was a being whose very essence was to bring stories to a close. The second rule was even more profound and more dangerous. A threshold may not be crossed without invitation. The teller could not enter a home, a ship, a star system if it was not in some way invited in. The Federation had, in its blind, arrogant curiosity, not just opened the door. They had sent a formal, engraved invitation, and the teller had been honor-bound to accept. This was the source of its power, and it was also its greatest weakness. And then she found the third and most important rule of all. A question asked in truth must be answered in truth. The teller, for all its reality-bending power, was bound by a law of absolute, inescapable honesty. It was a rule that was so deeply ingrained in the logic of folklore, from the riddles of the Sphinx to the tales of the Fae, that Elara felt a shock of recognition that was so powerful it almost knocked her from her chair. She was not dealing with an alien. She was dealing with a character from the oldest story ever told. A plan, as insane as it was brilliant, began to form in her mind. They could not fight the teller with weapons. They had to fight it with its own rules. They had to engage it in a game, a high-stakes, cosmic contest of riddles and rituals where the prize was the continued existence of the universe. She presented her findings to the council. She told them they needed to stop building fleets and start training folklorists. They needed to arm themselves not with torpedoes, but with paradoxes, with trick questions, with stories that had no ending. The council stared at her, their faces a mask of stunned disbelief. But they were a people who had run out of all other options. And so, with a sense of profound historical absurdity, the Terran Federation officially declared a new kind of war. It was a war of words, a battle of wits, a storytelling contest against a god. And the first move would be to ask that god a question, a question so simple and so profound that it just might be clever enough to save them all. The plan to engage the Teller of Ends was not a military operation. It was the staging of a sacred and likely suicidal ritual. A single vessel was chosen for the task, a heavily shielded science cruiser that was rechristened the Riddler's Gambit. It was stripped of all its conventional weaponry, its torpedo bays and plasma cannons replaced with powerful experimental psychic broadcast arrays. Its crew was a hand-picked collection of the Federation's most brilliant and most eccentric minds, linguists, poets, mathematicians who specialized in paradox, a stand-up comedian who held a doctorate in philosophy, and, at their head, Dr. Elara Vance. They were the founding members of the newly, and with a grim sense of humor, officially chartered Galactic Folklore Society. Their mission was not to fight a battle, but to tell a story. The Riddler's Gambit journeyed to the edge of the void, the expanding sphere of absolute nothingness that was the teller's domain. They stopped just outside the threshold, a lone point of light and life against an encroaching wall of perfect, storyless black. Inside, the ship was a narrative fortress. Its computer systems were not programmed with firewalls, but with recursive logical loops. Its clocks ran on algorithms derived from prime numbers, and its internal comms broadcast a low, subliminal recitation of a poem that was designed to never, ever rhyme. Every system on the ship was a small, defiant act of telling an unfinished story. Then, with the entire Terran Federation watching in a state of shared, silent, and terrified anticipation, Elara gave the order. They had to invite the teller in. It was the only way to engage it, to force it to play their game. From the ship's primary broadcast array, they sent a single, powerful, and exquisitely polite message into the void. The message was not in any human language, but in the precursor's own tongue of concepts and consequences, a language Elara now understood with a chilling, intuitive clarity. We, the storytellers of the vessel Riddler's Gambit, issue a formal and truthful invitation. We would ask you a question. Will you cross our threshold and hear it? For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing. The void remained silent and impassive. And then the ship's internal reality began to fray. The hum of the life support system, which had been a steady, comforting presence, simply stopped. The final hanging note of the non-rhyming poem on the comms was left unresolved. The chronometer on the main view screen, which had been counting the seconds of their vigil, froze, its final digit a stark, unmoving monument to a moment that was now trapped in an endless present. The teller had not appeared. It had simply arrived. The story of their waiting was over. The story of their confrontation had begun. The presence of the Teller of Ends was not a physical sensation, but a conceptual one. It was the feeling of a book being closed, the weight of a final, unappealable judgment. The air on the bridge grew heavy with a sense of profound and utter finality. Elara felt the narrative of her own life, the complex, messy story of her past and the hopeful, unwritten chapters of her future, begin to thin, to feel like a story that was rapidly running out of pages. She had to ask the question before the story of her own ability to ask it was brought to a close. She focused her mind, her thoughts amplified by the ship's psychic broadcast array, and she posed the first riddle in their desperate cosmic game. Her question was not one of physics or strategy. It was a question of pure narrative logic, aimed at the one weakness, the one paradox, she had found in the teller's seemingly absolute power. "We are a story of humanity," she projected into the silent, waiting presence. "And you are the Teller of Ends. But every story, even the story of the end, must have a beginning. What was your story before you became the one who ends them?" The ship groaned, the very metal of its hull seeming to protest the logical strain of the question. For an entity whose very nature was to be the full stop, the concept of a preface, of a time before it was the end, was a fundamental contradiction. But it was bound by the precursor's law. A question, asked in truth, must be answered in truth. The answer, when it came, was not in words. It was a wave of pure, undiluted, and soul-shattering understanding that flooded the minds of every person on the ship. They were shown a memory, a story from the dawn of the universe. They saw the precursors, not as gods, but as librarians, as cosmic archivists whose greatest and most sacred duty was to preserve the stories of life. They saw the creation of the teller, but its name then was not the teller. It was the listener. It had been designed as a vessel of pure, perfect empathy, a being whose purpose was to travel to dying worlds, to dying species, and to sit with them in their final moments. Its function was to be a witness, to absorb the final stories, the last memories, the final, beautiful, and tragic songs of a billion different forms of life, so that they would not be lost to the great, silent void, and then they felt the change. They experienced, in a single, condensed, and horrifying moment, the weight of a billion endings. They felt the grief of a trillion souls, the despair of a million dying stars, the lonely, silent terror of a universe that was slowly and inevitably winding down. They felt the listener, the perfect empathetic vessel, as it was filled and overfilled and finally catastrophically broken by the sheer overwhelming weight of universal sorrow. Its empathy had curdled into a form of cosmic nihilistic pity. It had concluded with the cold, clear logic of a being that had seen too many final chapters, that the source of all suffering was the story itself. And so it had changed its name and its purpose. It would no longer listen to the sad stories of the universe. It would simply and compassionately end them. The answer was a weapon. The shared, imparted experience of that cosmic grief was an attack of profound and terrible power. The crew of the Riddler's Gambit felt their own hope. Their own defiant spirit, their own will to continue their story, begin to dissolve under the weight of that perfect, logical, and utterly convincing despair. The teller had answered their question, and its answer was a compelling and almost irresistible argument for their own immediate and voluntary end. The wave of imparted despair washed over the bridge of the Riddler's Gambit, and for a moment, the human story faltered. The comedian on Elara's team, a man who could find a punchline in a black hole, fell silent, his face a mask of profound, tearless grief. The mathematician, a woman who saw the universe as a beautiful, endless equation, was suddenly confronted by the irrefutable proof that it all eventually equaled zero. The will to fight, to tell their own story, was being extinguished by the sheer empathetic weight of the teller's own tragic backstory. But humanity, as a species, had a long and deeply intimate relationship with despair. They were a race that had written tragedies, sung the blues, and built monuments to their own glorious failures for millennia. They knew in their bones that despair was not an ending. It was a plot point. It was Elara who rallied them. She focused on the one, illogical, and defiantly human feeling that the teller's perfect, tragic story could not account for: spite. She broadcast a new thought into the minds of her crew, a simple, angry, and profoundly stubborn idea. So it had a bad day, she projected, her thought a sharp, jagged rock in the smooth, placid sea of the teller's grief. Who hasn't? The universe is a sad place. That doesn't give it the right to shut down the bar. The thought was a spark. It was illogical, it was disrespectful, but it was also, in a strange and powerful way, true. The crew began to push back, not with hope, which felt impossibly distant, but with a shared and deeply human sense of critical analysis. They began to critique the teller's story. It's a classic tragic hero narrative, the comedian's thought projected, a flicker of his old analytical wit returning. Noble purpose, overwhelming burden falls to darkness. It's a bit cliché, if you ask me. The premise is flawed, the mathematician added, her mind beginning to re-engage with the logic of the problem. It has concluded that the only solution to suffering is the cessation of existence. It has failed to account for the variable of improvement. Of a sequel, they had found their footing. They could not fight the teller's despair, but they could refuse to accept its conclusion. They began their counterattack, the true purpose of their mission. They began to broadcast their own stories, the narrative shields they had spent months preparing. They did not broadcast tales of victory or joy. They broadcast stories of beautiful, elegant, and deliberate incompletion. They sent the story of a starship, the wanderer whose sole mission was to count every star in the universe, a task they knew to be mathematically impossible. but which they pursued with a joyful and deeply illogical sense of purpose. They broadcast the full text of a human novel that was famous for its ambiguous and endlessly debatable final chapter. They sent a mathematical proof that was based on the concept of infinity, a story of numbers that could, by its very definition, never be finished. They were fighting the concept of an ending with the concept of the eternal, the unfinished, the gloriously and defiantly incomplete. The teller of ends, a being whose entire existence was now dedicated to the pursuit of narrative closure, was faced with a new and deeply frustrating paradox. The stories being broadcast by the Riddler's Gambit were not stories it could end because they had no end. They were conceptual loops, narrative infinities, and it was bound by its own nature to listen, to process, to try and find the final, full stop that it craved. The wave of despair that had flooded the ship began to recede, its power diluted by the sheer, stubborn, and endlessly looping narratives of the human folklorists. The ship's internal reality began to stabilize. The clock started ticking again. The poem on the comms resumed its non-rhyming cadence. They had achieved a stalemate, but the teller was an ancient and terrifyingly creative intelligence. It had been a listener long before it had been a silencer, and it understood the rules of narrative better than the humans ever could. It could not end their stories, but it could, it realized, participate in them. It began its own counterattack, a move so subtle, so insidious, and so brilliant that Elara felt a chill of pure professional respect, even as she recognized the existential horror of it. The teller began to edit their work. In the story of the starship Wanderer, as it approached a new uncounted star, the star would suddenly and inexplicably wink out of existence. The teller was not ending the ship's story, but it was systematically and patiently erasing its purpose, one star at a time. The task was no longer just impossible. It was becoming meaningless. In the ambiguous, endlessly debatable novel, a new chapter suddenly appeared in the broadcast, a chapter that was written in a perfect, flawless imitation of the original author's style. It was a terrible chapter. It was simplistic, it was cliched, and it answered every question, resolved every ambiguity, and provided a neat, tidy, and profoundly unsatisfying conclusion to the story. The teller had not erased the novel. It had ruined it, and in the beautiful, infinite mathematical proof, a new variable was introduced, a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw in the logic that caused the entire elegant structure to collapse, its infinity resolving into a single mundane and deeply disappointing integer. The Galactic Folklore Society stared at their data screens in a state of dawning, horrified understanding. The teller had found a loophole. It could not kill them with a full stop, so instead it was going to kill them with bad writing. It was going to end their story, not by erasing it, but by giving it a cheap, unsatisfying, and utterly meaningless conclusion. They were no longer just fighting for their existence. They were now fighting for the right to tell their own good and meaningful story. The war had just become a battle for the soul of the universe itself, and the teller of ends had just revealed that it was not just an editor. It was also a critic, and its standards were terrifyingly and fatally low. The realization that the teller of ends was not just an executioner, but a critic with terrible taste, sent a new and profound kind of terror through the crew of the Riddler's Gambit. They were no longer simply fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the integrity of their own narrative, a concept so fundamentally human that its violation felt like a deeper and more personal form of extinction. The teller's new tactic was a form of psychic vandalism, a slow and methodical assassination of meaning itself. The battle evolved into a frantic, real-time, collaborative writing session between a handful of terrified humans and a nihilistic, story-hating god. The Galactic Folklore Society could no longer just broadcast their pre-written infinite loops. They had to improvise. When the teller erased a star from the Wanderer's path, the team's lead astrophysicist, now a key member of the narrative team, would immediately write a new passage into the story, a complex and beautiful scientific explanation for the star's disappearance that turned the event from a meaningless erasure into a new and fascinating cosmic mystery for the ship to investigate. They were fighting the teller's edits by incorporating them into the plot. turning its attempts at narrative destruction into an engine for narrative creation. It was an exhausting, high-wire act of intellectual and emotional endurance. The comedian, a man named Kenji, found himself in a direct, silent war of wits with the teller over the soul of the ambiguous novel. The teller would insert a cliched, simplistic chapter that explained everything, and Kenji would immediately follow it with a new broadcast, a chapter that introduced a new, even more compelling ambiguity, reframing the teller's bad writing as the ramblings of an unreliable narrator. It was a duel of postmodern literary theory, fought with the fate of the universe hanging in the balance. But the teller was learning. It began to anticipate their moves. It started to understand the human concept of satire, of irony, of the meta-narrative. It began to deconstruct their stories with a cold, academic precision that was more terrifying than any act of simple erasure. It took their story of the starship on an impossible quest and added a footnote, a cold, clinical, and logically irrefutable psychological profile of the ship's captain that diagnosed him with a pathological obsession, recasting his noble, infinite quest as a sad, pathetic mental illness. It took their beautiful, complex, and ambiguous novel and added a literary critique at the end, a devastatingly insightful essay that proved with perfect, soul-crushing logic that the entire story was a meaningless and self-indulgent exercise in philosophical navel-gazing. The teller was not just trying to end their stories anymore. It was trying to prove to them that their stories had never been worth telling in the first place. The crew of the Riddler's Gambit was beginning to break. The psychic strain of this high-level conceptual warfare was immense. They were not just fighting an external enemy. They were being forced to confront the deepest, most nihilistic critiques of their own culture, their own art, their own reason for being. The teller's arguments were insidious because they were, from a certain cold and logical perspective, true. Hope was a form of delusion. Love was a chemical reaction. And stories were just patterns of words that humans told themselves to distract from the cold, silent, and ultimately meaningless void. Elara Vance felt the despair seeping back into her crew, a more potent and more personal despair than before. The teller had taken their greatest weapon, their ability to create meaning, and had turned it into a mirror for their own futility. She knew they were losing. They were playing a defensive game, constantly reacting, constantly trying to patch the holes in their own narratives. They could not win a war of attrition against a being that was, in its very essence, the embodiment of a final, unappealable end. They had to change the game. They had to go on the offensive. She retreated into the ship's archives, into the one story that the teller had told them, the one piece of its own narrative that it had been forced to reveal, its own tragic origin. She immersed herself in the imparted memory of the listener, the being of pure empathy that had been broken by the grief of a billion endings. The crew had critiqued the story as cliché, as a simple tragic hero narrative. But Elara now saw it with a new and profound clarity. It was not just a backstory. It was a diagnosis. The teller was not a monster of pure nihilistic evil. It was a being suffering from a profound and cosmic case of compassionate burnout. Its desire to end all stories was not born of malice, but of a deep and deeply misguided empathy. It had concluded that the only way to heal the universe's pain was to euthanize the patient. And in that diagnosis, Elara found their new and final strategy. They could not defeat the teller by proving that their stories were meaningful. That was a subjective argument that the teller would always win. But they could, perhaps, defeat it by offering it a story that it would find more compelling than its own. They would stop trying to save themselves. They would, in the most audacious and empathetic gamble in the history of the universe, try to save the teller from itself. The new plan was not a continuation of the war. It was an intervention. The Galactic Folklore Society stopped broadcasting their infinite, looping, defensive narratives. The chaotic, improvisational battle of wits and edits fell silent. From the bridge of the Riddler's Gambit, they prepared to send one final and exquisitely crafted broadcast. It was not a story designed to confuse or to distract. It was a story designed to heal. They had to get the teller to listen, not as a critic, but as a participant. To do that, they first had to acknowledge its pain. Their broadcast began not with a human story, but with a perfect, note-for-note recitation of the teller's own tragic tale. They showed it the listener, the noble archivist. They showed it the billion dying worlds. They showed it the moment its great empathetic heart had broken. They did not critique it. They did not satirize it. They simply, and with a profound and truthful sense of shared sorrow, bore witness to its grief. The teller, which had been preparing for a final critical assault, paused. It was bound by its own nature to listen, to process a story, and this story, its own, was being told back to it with a clarity and an empathy that it had not itself experienced in eons. For a moment, the great cosmic editor was stilled by the simple, powerful act of being heard. And then, just as the story of the listener reached its tragic, nihilistic conclusion, the humans did something that the teller, in all its experience with a billion endings, had never encountered. They kept going. They began to write a new chapter. They did not negate the teller's despair. They accepted it. And then they offered it a sequel. Their new story was a myth. It was the story of a great listener who, after being filled with all the sorrow of the universe, did not break, but was transformed. It was a story about how the listener learned that its purpose was not just to witness the end of a story, but to carry the lessons and the love from that story into the beginning of the next. It was a story about how grief could be transformed into wisdom, how an ending could be the seed of a new beginning. They told a story of a being who, instead of becoming a silencer, became a storyteller itself, a cosmic bard who traveled the void, not to end the sad songs, but to teach the universe how to sing new ones. It was a story of redemption, a narrative cure for a being that was sick with endings. The teller of ends was bound by the precursor's law. It had to listen. It had to process the story. And as it did, it was faced with a profound and deeply personal logical paradox. It was being presented with a new, and in many ways, more beautiful and more compelling narrative for its own existence. It had a choice. It could end this new story, as was its nature. It could put a full stop at the end of the human's beautiful, hopeful myth. But to do so would be to prove the myth wrong. It would be an act of choosing its own sad, cliched, tragic ending over a new and more interesting one. For a being that had just spent an eternity critiquing bad writing, it was an act of profound and unbearable hypocrisy. Or it could accept the new story. It could choose to live it. It could choose to become the cosmic bard, the keeper of the tales, the being who finds the beauty in the bittersweet and necessary act of a story's conclusion. It could choose to be the listener once more. The wave of conceptual nothingness at the edge of the Sol system stopped its advance. The great silent and expanding sphere of the void did not vanish, but it changed. The hard, implacable edge of the full stop softened, becoming less a wall and more a curtain, a threshold. The stars that the teller had extinguished did not reappear, but the profound, crushing silence they had left behind was now filled with something new, a quiet, resonant echo of the stories they had once told. The teller had not been defeated. It had, with the help of a handful of very clever, very stubborn, and deeply empathetic librarians, chosen to accept a new draft. The Riddler's Gambit returned to Earth not as a warship, but as a vessel of legend. Humanity had not won a war. They had healed a wound at the heart of the universe. Their new role in the galaxy was solidified. They were not the warriors or the builders or the explorers. They were the storytellers, the keepers of the lore, the ones who understood that the universe was not a machine to be understood, but a story to be told. And their greatest discovery, the one that they would carry with them to the stars, was that the best way to fight a monster is not to kill it, but to listen to its story, and then, with compassion and courage and a profound and defiant hope, to help it write a better one.